They called them relics, but when you opened the box, the smell wasn't of holiness. It was rot ancient, human rot, and yet churches paid fortunes to display them. Most men go their entire lives blind to the machinery that grinds beneath society's most sacred institutions. But you weren't meant to hear this. This isn't history. This is a wound, barely scabbed over, pulsing beneath the skin of the American religious past. In the rolling backwoods of 18th century Pennsylvania, hidden beneath steeples and sermons, a family empire flourished not in gold, not in land, but in the flesh of the devout. The Whitmore family, revered by clergy and whispered about by locals, were artisans, craftsmen, they said. But their finest works were not carved in wood or cast in silver. They were stitched from sinew, preserved bone, the hearts of children. You've heard tales of saints, of relics revered across Europe. Fragments of bone said to heal the sick, drops of blood said to bring visions. But how many of those sacred artifacts ever belonged to the souls they claimed? And how many were repurposed? Between 1745 and 1792, over 70 individuals vanished. Across rural Pennsylvania, devout women, orphan boys, wandering preachers, all gone, their names erased from the record, and in their place, relics, dozens of them, dozens too many. The Whitmore family did not believe in murder. No murder is crude, criminal, temporary. They believed in sanctification, in the elevation of the body into something greater, and like all twisted justifications throughout history, they cloaked their actions in divine purpose. They convinced others to believe it too. Church leaders, elders, bishops, a network of spiritual aristocrats, hungry for relics they could parade before their flocks. Relics they didn't dare question too deeply. These weren't accidents. This wasn't rogue behavior. This was a system ancient, methodical, and horrifyingly effective. A dark sanctum hidden behind the illusion of piety. You're not watching a story. You're entering a crypt. The deeper we go, the harder it will be to unsee. But that's the price of truth. The Whitmores didn't just corrupt the church. They exposed a hunger embedded in faith itself, a hunger for power wrapped in ritual. Still here? Good. Then you're ready for what comes next. There's a reason the Whitmore story was buried. Not a race buried. Locked behind church vaults and sealed records. Not to protect the innocent, but to protect the guilty. In 1742, Nathaniel Whitmore arrived from England with a trade and a plan. He was no ordinary craftsman. He came from a lineage of preservationists, mortuary guildsmen once employed by the Catholic Church to prepare relics for royal chapels and papal display. His hands knew how to preserve, to sanctify, to transform decay into devotion. But in the New World, far from Vatican scrutiny, he would know. Longer wait for saints to die. He would create them. He settled in Chester County, 30 miles west of Philadelphia, a region devout and remote, a land where fear of God was only rivaled by fear of the forest. There, he built his workshop, oak walls, iron tools, wide windows for light, and a basement no one was ever invited to see. The facade was perfect. Chalices, altar boxes, communion plates, each a masterpiece. Ministers came from miles around to commission pieces. They spoke of Nathaniel as a man touched by grace. His eyes were steady, his voice low and reverent. He spoke in scripture, but behind those gray eyes lay cold ambition. His wife, Elizabeth, silent, refined, was the strategist. She managed correspondence, scheduled church visits, and tracked which ministers were impressionable. Therefore children were trained early. Thomas in the workshop, Sarah and Mary in house affairs, and William quiet. Strange William was given full freedom to roam the woods. He studied animals, dissected them, learned how to preserve the small things first. But it was the churches that needed Nathaniel. You see, Protestantism lacked the holy objects that Catholics held dear. No saints' bones, no blood-soaked robes, no miracle-working skulls. And Nathaniel promised them just that, authentic relics. He claimed to have European contacts, monks, dealers, quiet channels. The ministers, craving legitimacy and sacred power, never asked too many questions. The first gift was well received, a wooden reliquary gilded with gold leaf, containing what he described as the knuckle of an obscure Irish martyr. It healed a woman's blindness, or so they claimed. Word spread, orders came in, and the Whitmore business was reborn not as craftsmen of religious items, but as architects of manufactured holiness. But a relic needs a body, and Nathaniel had already chosen the first one. Her name was Mary Collins, a healer, a widow, known For her kindness, she would vanish on a cold night in 1745, and what was taken from her would make the Whitmores very, very rich. Mary Collins did not scream. According to Thomas Whitmore's deathbed confession, she simply looked confused, concerned, but not afraid as Nathaniel led her through the rear entrance of the workshop. The storm had already begun, the snow muffled sound, and the wind erased tracks. It was the perfect night for a sanctification. The back room had been prepared, canvas draped across the floor, iron hooks arranged on the wall like the instruments of some forgotten rite. A single lantern cast long shadows. Elizabeth stood silently, her hands folded, her face unreadable. Thomas, just 16, watched from the stairs. He had been told this was to be a lesson in faith, a rite of passage. Mary asked, "Where's the boy?" Nathaniel answered by raising the mallet. 3 strikes. That was all. There was no struggle, no screams, only silence, and then the work began. Thomas's account is clinical. He describes the procedure not as a killing, but as a preparation. The body was washed, dressed in white. The joints were measured, the skin examined. Nathaniel marked the bone with charcoal lines, identifying the most spiritually charged fragments. These were not butchers. They were artisans operating under the belief that they were extracting holiness. Over 3 days, Mary Collins was transformed. Her femur was halved and boiled. Her heart was preserved in cedar oil and sealed in wax. Her fingertips, dried and wrapped in silk, were stitched into velvet pouches, all of it clean, precise, reverent. And then, the reliquaries were made, oak boxes, silver hinges, crosses, etched with obsessive care. One was given to the Harmony Meeting House, presented as a gift in her memory. No one questioned it. Why would they? It came from a respected craftsman. It was beautiful, holy, powerful, but inside it, hidden behind a sliding panel, was the first Whitmore relic, a shard of Mary's own rib. Weeks later, rumors began. A woman in Philadelphia claimed her seizure stopped after praying beside the relic. A boy's fever broke after touching it. The church grew crowded. Donations surged. Miracles, signs, proof of divine favor. But it wasn't heaven that answered their prayers. It was the dead. And the Whitmores had just discovered a market far more profitable and far more protected than any colonial trade. This wasn't just a business, it was the birth of a theology built on blood. By 1750, the Whitmore workshop no longer served just as a business. It had become a sanctum, a hidden cathedral of flesh and gold. The front room remained as always, a place of light, tools, and scripture. Ministers visited, commissioned new pieces, shared wine, and spoke of faith, but none of them ever saw what lay beneath. No outsider crossed into the cellar, not even the apprentices. Jacob Miller and Peter Collins Young, impressionable, fatherless, were hired to assist in public work. They carved, they polished, they packed boxes bound for churches as far as Virginia. But they never asked questions. They were warned. The cellar was sacred, entry was forbidden. Disobedience would mean dismissal, or worse. Meanwhile, the Whitmore name became synonymous with divine craftsmanship. Word of their connections to Europe spread like gospel. Protestant leaders, long envious of the Catholic tradition of relics, began whispering among themselves, what if relics could bring power without popery? What if sacred objects could transform humble congregations into hubs of spiritual authority? Nathaniel encouraged these thoughts, quietly, carefully. He met in candlelit parlors with select clergy, men already leaning toward mysticism. He told them the truth they wanted to hear, that God was restoring ancient power to the new world, that relics were appearing again, that miracles were returning through them. But there were conditions. The relics must remain secret, not paraded, not questioned. They were for the chosen few, ministers, elders, those strong enough to bear holy responsibility. And of course, donations were expected, substantial ones. This strategy worked. It didn't just prevent exposure, it turned customers into collaborators. Ministers began protecting the Whitmores. They vouched for their piety, shielded them from curious eyes, and in exchange, they received power, miracles, growth, fear of God. The system solidified, and as demand rose, so did the number of disappearances. A preacher traveling alone, a widowed midwife, a mute orphan boy, each vanished, each time. A relic soon appeared in a distant church, a tooth that wept oil, a finger bone that warmed it, the hand, a lock of hair that cured fever. None questioned how these things had surfaced, because the people were desperate, and desperation makes truth optional. This is how darkness spreads, not through overt violence, but through quiet agreements, one silent compromise at a time. And behind it all, the Whitmore smiling, praying, promising to deliver holiness, one body at a time. It was no longer about relics. That was just a bait. By 1760, the Whitmore family had constructed something far more potent, a supply chain of sanctified flesh, a closed loop of power, profit, and belief. Churches didn't just receive relics, they depended on them. Congregations were swelling, donations soared, healings, visions, and prophetic dreams followed wherever a Whitmore artifact appeared. Ministers, once cautious, now begged for more, but the supply required sacrifices. That's when Sarah Whitmore, the family's second daughter, began keeping records. Her journal, discovered over a century later inside a hidden chamber beneath the abandoned Whitmore estate, reveals a chilling level of precision. Victims were cataloged, bodies measured, relics assigned a value based on miraculous potential. One entry reads, "The widow Annabel, aged 52, known for fasting, minimal decay, heart relic retained warm for 3 days post-processing. Sold to New York Presbyterian for £80. This was a ritual. This was logistics, and through it all, the family remained untouchable. By then, Nathaniel was no longer seen merely as a craftsman. Among select church leaders, he had become something more, an apostle of divine restoration. He spoke in visions, claimed the Lord had shown him a new path for American faith, one not bound by Europe's traditions. A faith anchored in relics, in living miracles, in proof that required blood. Still think this was just a family of killers? No, the Whitmores weren't deviants. They were architects. They built a parallel system of power under the very nose of colonial religion. They preyed on the desperation of ministers, the gullibility of congregants, the silence of institutions too proud to question miracles that made them rich. And by now, their reach extended far beyond Pennsylvania. But here's where the descent deepens. In 1774, a storm hit Philadelphia. Not weather, ideology. Whispers among Quaker communities. Some said relics were appearing in churches that had once denounced them. Some said ministers were holding secret prayer gatherings, that artifacts were kept in locked drawers, only revealed to elders, that healings were happening, but only in churches connected to that craftsman family. From Chester, a schism began. Faith was dividing, and yet no one could expose them, because to expose the Whitmores meant exposing the miracles, and exposing the miracles meant confronting the horrifying truth that American holiness had been bought with butchered flesh. Now, if you're still watching, if your stomach hasn't turned, comment below the phrase, "Blood became the altar twice." That's how you lock this truth inside your identity and show the algorithm who's still awake in the age of sleep. We're not finished. 1776, while patriots declared liberty and fired muskets in the streets of Boston and Philadelphia, the Whitmores expanded. Revolution is chaos, and chaos is the perfect veil. Churches were burning, cities fracturing, clergy divided between loyalist and patriot. In this storm of change, Nathaniel saw opportunity, not risk. He understood something most men never do. When the old order collapses, the vultures feast first. The Whitmore workshop, now a 2-story complex with underground cellars, became a critical supplier of religious materials. Not just relics, but pulpits, Bibles, communion vessels, symbols of order in a collapsing world. Ministers didn't care where the items came from. They needed something to hold their fractured congregations together, and the Whitmores delivered. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Relics were no longer only spiritual objects. They became political weapons. A fragment of rib sent to cure wounds found its way to a field church, serving Continental soldiers. A lock of hair, wrapped in cloth, was rumored to protect against musket fire. The myth of holy protection spread like fire through the ranks. Demand surged. The Whitmores fed it. And in the shadows, they escalated. Children. It began with a boy named Joseph, 10 years old, orphaned by smallpox, known for praying over the other children. He vanished from a church-run asylum in 1782. His disappearance, like most in that era, was explained away runaway, disease, Indian raids. 3 months later, a church in eastern Pennsylvania unveiled a new relic, the preserved heart of a child. Martyr. Prayers offered before it, they claimed, cured sick infants. Parishioners wept. Ministers proclaimed divine favor. Donations poured in. And somewhere in the Whitmore estate, William Whitmore, now a grown man with a surgeon's hands and a dead stare, began refining the preservation process for smaller bodies. Sarah's journal confirms it. William believes the innocence of youth amplifies relic potency. Father resisted at first, but the results undeniable. To miracles reported within a week, demand has quintupled. You see, this isn't just evil, it's evolution. The Whitmores weren't reacting to chaos. They were harnessing it, turning national revolution into spiritual war. They weren't parasites. They were engineers guiding the path of belief, one hidden corpse at a time. And the churches, they didn't resist. They adapted. Some even requested specific ages. Others asked for relics bound to certain ailment size, hands, lungs. This wasn't faith. This was inventory. The American soul was being bought and sold piece by piece on altars built of silent agony. And the men meant to stop it. They were too busy holding candles before boxes filled with bones that used to smile. By 1785, the Whitmore operation was more than a secret. It was a shadow institution operating parallel to the American church, with networks more disciplined than many military commands. Over 50 confirmed relics circulated across 7 colonies, each one sourced from an unrecorded body, each one surrounded by whispered healings, visions, conversions. It had become a divine arms race. Ministers scrambled for access. Congregations grew addicted to the presence of sanctified flesh. Entire revivals were built around what was hidden inside velvet boxes. And yet, the Whitmores couldn't keep up. That was their first mistake. Greed forces expansion, and expansion requires trust. So, for the first time and for decades, the family broke their cardinal rule. They let outsiders into the cellar. To apprentices, Daniel Foster and Reuben Clark had proven loyal, hardworking, pious, eager. But as the pressure mounted, as shipments fell behind and commissions grew louder, Thomas, now aging, bitter, half-mad, opened the basement door. Daniel was the first to see it. He would later describe it in a letter, smuggled out of a debtor's prison in 1791. I thought myself prepared. I had heard rumors, felt things, but nothing could prepare me. There were racks not of tools, but of bodies, skinless, preserved, numbered, their eyes gone, their teeth stored in velvet-lined drawers. I was told they were raw material, that God had chosen them. Thomas, now the family patriarch, explained the process to Daniel as one might teach farming or carpentry. It was business, necessary, divine, but Daniel had seen enough. He fled the estate 3 days later. He didn't go to the authorities. There were none who'd listen. He went to a man named Elijah Thompson, a former lawyer turned Quaker minister, tasked by the Philadelphia yearly meeting to investigate irregular religious practices in frontier churches. Elijah was methodical, disciplined, and deeply suspicious of miracles that came without accountability. Daniel gave him names, churches, transactions, details only a true insider would know. The machinery had finally been seen from the outside, and cracks began to spread, but still, no rests, no raids, not yet, because every church touched by the Whitmores, every minister who had accepted a relic was now complicit. To expose the family was to expose themselves, so the silence held. But Elijah did not stop. He understood what he was chasing wasn't just murder. It was systemic belief built on human sacrifice, a doctrine more ancient than Christianity itself, and he was willing to burn everything to expose it. The reckoning had begun. Elijah Thompson knew what he was stepping into. He didn't bring torches. He didn't bring a mob. He brought documents, testimonies, quiet interviews with ministers who trembled behind their collars. Each one had accepted a Whitmore relic. Each one had seen miracles, and each, when pressed, admitted they had no idea where the relics came from, except one, Reverend Allen Brewster, from a church near the Maryland border, broke. He confessed that in 1784, Nathaniel Whitmore himself had visited bearing a reliquary said to contain a fragment of an ancient child martyr's skull. Brewster, skeptical at first, asked questions. That night, Nathaniel returned with 2 elders from Philadelphia, and the next morning, Brewster signed the ledger. Elijah took that signed record and placed it beside Daniel Foster's letter. It was enough. He traveled to Chester County under the guise of conducting a Quaker visitation. But his true purpose was surgical. Observe the family inside the estate, confirm what others only whispered. He was invited for dinner. Sarah greeted him, gracious, soft-spoken, draped in gray linen. She led him through the house like a hostess showing off sacred ground. The Whitmore home was immaculate. No signs of rot. No blood. The family appeared serene. Elizabeth, though aged, smiled. Warmly, William barely spoke, but Elijah noticed the subtle things. The locked doors on the lower level, the heavy floorboards, the smell not of death, but of preservation, alcohol, cedar oil, powdered lime, and most of all, the children's drawings. Dozens of them hung in the hallway near the staircase. Crude sketches, figures in robes, altars, boxes. One depicted a woman's face, weeping, with red lines drawn from her eyes to her chest. Elijah stared at that drawing for a long time, and then came the moment. During the meal, he asked gently, "What do you think makes a relic holy?" The room froze. Thomas set down his knife. William stared. Sarah smiled, but her knuckles whitened around her fork. Nathaniel, old now, but still sharp, replied, "It is not the object that is holy. It is the use." That was confirmation. Elijah left that evening, and within 72 hours, he submitted a full report to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the Anglican Synod, and quietly too to former Continental officers with ties to the new federal justice system. Because he knew the churches would bury this. Only a public reckoning could destroy the Whitmores. But the family sensed it too. That week, Thomas burned the workshop ledger. William relocated the remains beneath the orchard, and Elizabeth wrote a final letter to a bishop in Virginia containing just 6 words. The relics must be preserved. Always. The clock had started ticking, and in the shadows, both sides prepared for the confrontation to come. The storm broke in the winter of 1786. Elijah Thompson returned to Chester County, this time not alone. With him came the federal marshals, armed with warrants drafted in silence, signed by men who knew what would happen if these truths reached the wrong ears. This wasn't just about murder. It was about collapse, about faith being built on corpses. They arrived at dawn, snow-blanketed. The estate, smoke curled from the chimneys. The Whitmore house stood silent, proud, rotting from within. Thomas answered the door. He looked old, sunken, eyes hollowed by decades of unspoken crimes. For a moment, he didn't speak, just looked past Elijah, toward the trees. Then, he stepped aside. What followed was not resistance, but resignation. They searched the workshop first. Nothing. Clean. The clean. Tools arranged with surgical precision. The apprentices gone vanished days earlier. But beneath the floorboards, behind a false wall in the cellar, the truth waited. 17 boxes. Each one labeled not with names, but with symbols, crosses, stars, eyes. Inside, they found bones, small ones, fabric, hair, teeth wrapped in cloth. One contained the entire preserved hand of a child, the nails delicately painted gold. Elijah did not speak. He didn't have to. The marshals gagged from the stench of chemicals and rot. But what truly turned their faces pale were the ledgers, partially burned, water damaged, but legible in places, transactions, names, churches, payments. Each relic linked to a body. Each body linked to a location. The scope was unthinkable. Over 120 relics, and at least 60 for confirmed victims. And this was just one site. Back upstairs, Elizabeth Whitmore calmly poured tea for the marshals. She asked if they would like sugar. When they declined, she smiled, folded her hands, and said, "We only did what they were too afraid to ask for." She was arrested without resistance. Thomas was taken separately. William, however, was gone. He had fled the night before, taking with him the boxes, one black satchel, and his mother's final letter. They never found him. Within weeks, news of the raid reached church leaders across the colonies. Some denied knowing the family, others claimed they were deceived. A few quietly disappeared. Entire congregations dissolved overnight. Elijah tried to publish the findings. Only one newspaper printed a summary, 3 paragraphs on fraudulent relics in Pennsylvania. The rest vanished, suppressed, paid off, denounced as malicious anti-religious slander. But the damage had already been done. Faith had been poisoned, not by unbelievers, but by believers willing to sanctify murder so long as it filled pews. The Whitmore legacy was sealed not in court, but in silence, because no institution will confess the truth when it profits from the lie. They buried the Whitmore name, not through justice but through forgetting. Thomas died in prison 6 months after the raid. No trial, no confession beyond the one already found: his final journal, discovered beneath his cot, stained with ink, sweat, and blood. His last words read, I no longer believe in God, only in consequence. Elizabeth vanished from the public record. Some say she was taken to a convent under an assumed name. Others say she drank from a chalice meant for the dead of communion forged from her own victims. No grave bears her name, no church mourned her, and William, he became a ghost, but not a quiet one. Reports surfaced for years. Whispers of a one-eyed man offering relics to southern churches. Murmurs in New Orleans of a holy merchant selling healing bones wrapped in velvet. One tale from 1803 speaks of a small church in Georgia where the sick were cured by a blessed heart encased in glass until the glass cracked and the heart bled. No one asked where it came from, because even after everything, the relics still worked. That's the part they never printed. The part even Elijah Thompson refused to speak aloud. They worked, not because of holiness, but because of belief. Because power doesn't care about purity, it feeds on need. And the institutions, they adjusted. Records were sealed. Churches quietly removed artifacts. Pulpits were rebuilt. Ministers reassigned. A few were excommunicated. None were charged. The narrative was rewritten. The Whitmores were frauds. The relics were forgeries, and the miracles, coincidence. But the truth was archived, hidden behind coded language in private collections, buried beneath theological denials, locked in vaults labeled heretical movements, not for circulation until now. Because history has a pulse, and it always returns when it's ignored. You've heard their story, you've walked through blood-soaked pews, you've seen how belief twisted, institutionalized, and weaponized becomes the perfect mask for evil. But ask yourself, why was this erased? Not to protect the dead, but to protect the systems they fed. Because if the Whitmores were exposed, how many others might we find? How many relics today still sit behind altars, sealed in boxes no one's allowed to open? How many miracles still draw crowds to places built on forgotten screams? You've seen behind the veil now, and that knowledge has a price. Because once you know how power is sanctified with silence, how belief can be stitched to bone, you don't go back. You either look away or you watch everything burn.